And before we begin talking about student loan repayment programs, I'd like to first introduce myself and my co-presenter, Vaishali Rao. I'm a partner in Hinshaw's Labor and Employment Practice Group. I focus my practice on advising clients on issues relating to executive compensation, employee benefits, and federal taxation. Vaishali is a partner in Hinshaw's Consumer Financial Services Group. And Vaishali, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Vaishali Rao, and I focus my practice on counseling clients on regulatory requirements and risk reduction, primarily in consumer financial services.
Thank you, Vaishali. One of the nice things about our firm is that we can bring together lawyers from a variety of practice areas in providing comprehensive advice to our clients, and that multi-specialty approach definitely applies to the types of programs that we'll be discussing today. So with that, I think we're ready to jump into our discussion of student loan repayment programs. And the reason why we wanted to put on this presentation primarily is we've identified a problem, and we think that this type of program is a good solution. So there are a number of student loan statistics that are out there. Some of you may be familiar with them. Right now there's over $1.5 trillion of outstanding student loan debt. The average graduate in 2016 came out with $37,000 of student loan debt. We have 45 million Americans with student loan debt, which is about 15% of the population. And if you think about that, anyone under the age of 18 probably is at zero. And most of the older people are at zero, so that's a pretty substantial chunk of Americans that have student loan debt, and that trend is accelerating. Right now, more than 2 out of 3 undergraduates come out of college with some student loan debt. Another problem that employers have identified: retention issues for the younger workforce. There was a recent article by Gallup that noted that 21% of millennials who in the workforce have changed jobs within the past year. And of course, that type of turnover has a cost. Over $30 billion is the estimate for the cost of that type of turnover, which is a problem that employers have to deal with. Employers also are concerned about implementing the optimal structure of their employee benefits packages, making sure that what they're offering meets the needs of their workforce and is actually being effective in recruiting and retaining talent. And with any type of program, any type of benefit program, we have to make sure that it's organized to comply with a variety of applicable state and federal law, which certainly will apply to student loan programs. So those are the problems that we are dealing with, and the goal of today's program is to show you how student loan repayment programs work and how employers can be part of the solution for those problems. The first piece, chipping away at debt reduction. When you look at the average amount that a student loan borrower repays every month, usually it's less than $300. 3 out of 4 borrowers are at that level. So a relatively small outlay per employee by the employer would have a significant impact on that monthly payment. For example, if you have an extra $100 going towards repayments, that's a substantial amount compared to the total monthly amount that the employees pay, but probably not a substantial amount for the employers. The student loan repayment programs are also an effective retention tool. There are studies out there that suggest that for the younger workers between the ages of 22 and 33, 86% of young workers would commit to an employer for a 5-year period if that employer offered to pay back their student loans. And then, of course, when you are structuring your employee benefits packages, you want to make sure that you're offering customized solutions for your changing workforce. And you want to offer benefits that people actually want. And that could be a powerful differentiator for employers who do offer those types of programs. So if you're looking at your benefits offerings and you're finding that some of them are not very effective in recruiting or retaining your workforce, we think that student loan repayment programs would be something that would be effective, and you may want to consider allocating your dollars towards those types of programs as opposed to the programs that are not as effective. So how do we do this? What's the best way to structure a student loan repayment program? And there are several critical issues that employers have to be aware of. We're going to discuss the basic structure of employer student loan repayment programs, how to set it up. I'm going to talk about some tax and possible ERISA concerns for these programs. Vaishali is going to talk about a variety of different compliance issues. And the ultimate goal for setting up this program is to structure an employee benefit program. Doesn't raise your cost materially. It attracts and retains talent, takes advantage of any tax benefits that are available to you, and you do it the right way. So you are providing a positive corporate image both to your workforce and to any outsiders. So we thought we'd start with the basics of how these student loan repayment programs would work. Usually the first question that employers have is how do we establish employee eligibility? And the good news here is that employers have broad discretion in deciding who's going to benefit from these programs. Under current law, there's no federal income tax subsidy for employer assistance towards student loans. So if you're not getting any tax benefit, there aren't any non-discrimination requirements that would apply to other common employee benefits like a 401k plan or a health plan or cafeteria plan. Basically, you can decide whoever you want to participate, and you can target it so that you're focused only on those particular workers that are in highest demand. You can focus it and only offer it to high-salaried workers. A number of employers offer it only to low-salaried workers. So really, there's unlimited flexibility in deciding who's going to be eligible for these types of programs. So when you're sitting down and thinking about implementing a program, I think it's appropriate to consider what would be the most effective retention tool. Are your current programs attracting and retaining the employees that you want? And if not, how can you structure it, including the use of student loan repayment programs, to accomplish that goal? And oftentimes what we'll see is employers will say, well, we like this idea, and our younger workers really like it, but our older workers sometimes have they think, what about me? How can I benefit from this? Especially those who just finished paying off their large student loans.
Hey, Tony, can I just add in an interesting statistic? I think we do tend to think of student loan borrowers as being younger folks, but actually in the last about 10 years, student loan debt for older Americans has about quadrupled. And so persons ages 60 and up have, I think it's about $70 billion in student loan debt. And probably you note the Parent Plus program down there. There probably will be some changes, and there have already been some changes that mean that older Americans will have to continue to take out larger amounts of debt, probably in the private marketplace. So this is going to continue to be an issue for people of all different kinds of ages.
Yes, thank you. And that's an important point, and it's also important for employers to keep in mind that depending on how you structure your program, you can benefit quite a bit of your workers. This is not something that is designed only for 20-something workers. This is something that can apply to your entire workforce, especially if you're talking about parent loans and giving assistance to parents who are paying off student loans for their children. The next question that you're going to look at is, once you've decided who's eligible, how much are we going to provide? And what is going to be the structure of that payment that we make? Typically what we've seen is that it's a monthly benefit. The amount that the employer offers would usually be less than the full amount due by the employee. Common range would be between $50 and $200 per month. So it's not a huge amount of money for an individual, but you can structure it so that it makes a significant difference based on the statistics that we had talked about earlier for the monthly obligation of each employee. It's also common to see annual or lifetime maximums. For example, let's say you can participate in this program, but no more than $10,000 over the course of your career. And as we talked about earlier, there's no tax subsidy, so there really are no rules for how you structure the program. And so you can tie the benefit amount to any different metric that you want. So you can tie the amount of the monthly payment towards the student loans to employee performance, if they get particularly good reviews, if they are particularly profitable. It would be similar to how you structure a discretionary bonus program. So this would be a very powerful incentive for employees to improve their performance, and as a result not only get paid more, but also have more go towards their student loans.
And just to add to that, and so Tony's right, what we're really focusing on is this sort of monthly benefit payment amount. There really are two kinds of, in the very big picture, there are really two kinds of employer-assisted repayment programs. One is something we're not going to touch on a lot today, but certainly let us know if you have questions about it. It really is more like a government, a lot of times state governments will kind of assume the role of paying somebody's student loan, so they really step in the shoes of the borrower. The type of program that we're referencing is really an employer giving some contribution to a student loan payment, so it may be a supplement to the payment or some particular percentage or what have you. So we're really focusing on that latter group of benefits. So and what you see on the screen there are the different types of what I call program administrators. I think for the employers that are out there, they may think of them as vendors too. These are the folks, and I'm sure there are others too, I've put a lot of the common ones up there, but these are the folks that really have relationships with the servicers. So this is a really important function because servicing student loans is very complicated. I'm going to talk a little bit about that when we turn over and start talking about some of the consumer financial regulatory requirements. Again, because it is such a complicated space, these types of entities really try to make the administration of the benefit as seamless as possible. And they do a really good job with it, and most of them, again, provide similar kinds of benefits in the sense, they provide similar kinds of services, but they're all a little bit different, and it is important to know and understand what are those differences. We're going to cover some of that a little later in the presentation.
And as you can see, there are some very well-established companies on this list, and some newer companies, some offshoots of very well-established financial companies, but the trend is definitely towards these types of programs, and I think you'll see more administrators becoming involved in this space. I think the most recent stat that I saw was that only 4 or 5% of employers currently offer a student loan repayment assistance program to their employees, but there is a projection of explosive growth in those types of programs, getting up to 20% of employers or more in the very near future, and I think you'll see these types of administrators continue to increase their efforts to bring more people into that type of program. So a few other points on the basics of student loan repayment programs. Often you'll see that there will be a service requirement tied to participation. So if someone is going to be receiving a benefit, must they continue to work for an additional period after they receive that benefit? That's very common, and it's permitted, and I think effective in retention for retention purposes. But then the question becomes, what happens if someone promises to stay and then leaves? How can an employer claw back an amount that had already been paid? Um, this can be a tricky issue for employers. Sometimes, given the amounts involved, it may not even be worth the time of the employer to go after it. But for other employers who have substantial payments, sometimes even for certain professionals into the six figures, it definitely would make sense to try to go after amounts that have not been fully earned. If an employer does pay towards a student loan, that amount will be treated as compensation when it's paid, even if they haven't fully met the service requirement yet. If it, in turn, results in a forfeiture because they did not satisfy the service requirement, then an employer may seek recovery of amounts that had previously been paid. At that point, there would be some adjustments that would have to be made with respect to the taxation of the amounts previously paid. But you want to make sure that you're careful about offsetting amounts that you owe to a departing employee based on a clawback provision from a student loan program, because that would have to comply with a number of different requirements, including state wage payment and collection laws. Next topic that we wanted to talk about is the federal income tax treatment of these types of programs, which is part of the structure of how employers want to put these together. And I think this is an area that we can expect to see some changes probably in the near future. But as things stand now, there currently are no specific tax benefits for employer payments towards employee student loans. So if an employer does make a payment towards an employee student loan, it's treated as any other taxable income and wage payment would be. It is compensation. It's subject to FICA and Medicare tax at the time of payment. It's subject to federal income tax withholding. So if you pay $100 towards someone's student loan, there has to be with income tax withholding from that amount that will have to come from other compensation. And of course, it would, as wages, it would be reported on a Form W-2 rather than on a Form 1099. Sometimes employers aren't sure how to treat this, but any type of student loan repayment assistance that an employer provides should be treated as any other type of wages. Now, the general rule for tax consequences of assistance for student loans, there are some exceptions out there. For certain medical providers, there's a government loan repayment program where if they go to serve in communities that have limited access to care, there can be up to $50,000 of student loan assistance that those providers can receive completely tax-free. There's also federal legislation that provides for student loan forgiveness with respect to students that have military service and are deployed to a combat zone. So there is some recognition in the Internal Revenue Code for student loan repayments being tax-free. And the question is that general concept going to be expanded? Another interesting quirk, as I see it, a quirk of the tax law, is that Section 127 of the Code provides for tax-free educational assistance, but not student loan assistance. So under Section 127, an employer can provide up to $5,250 every year, completely tax-free to their employees, and that's regardless of the purpose of whatever educational class that the employee enrolls in. So it could be related to the business, it could be completely unrelated to the business, but that amount of money can be received totally tax-free under this type of program. But under current law, that does not apply to a student loan repayment assistance program. Over the last few years especially, we have seen some legislative proposals that would change that. Most recently, the Employer Participation in Student Loan Assistance Act would have expanded Section 127 benefits. So if you get $5,250 to go enroll in a course at your local community college, you could also get that same amount tax-free for repayment of student loans. That still is at the proposed stage, but I think that would be something that would be very popular if there were to be changes to educational assistance tax consequences. That's definitely something that you will want to keep an eye on. There also have been other efforts to provide some benefits. A common thing that we've seen recently is enhancements to Section 529 plans. A Section 529 plan is an account that you can use to pay qualified education expenses without having to incur capital gains on the earnings from amounts that are building up in those plans. Right now it would not apply to student loan repayment programs, but there have been some legislative proposals that would expand that. We've also seen a number of state-level efforts. The example here, the state of Massachusetts, which has proposed legislation that would provide a state tax deduction for employers that offer this type of program. So one of the questions that we get is, okay, if there's no tax benefit, why would we do this? If we could pay someone $1,000 cash, or we could pay them $900 cash plus $100 towards the student loan, what difference does it make? And that's a good question. There is no specific tax benefit, and the unrestricted use of funds generally is thought to be better than a restricted use of funds. But even without that tax benefit, some employers are finding that these programs can still be attractive. Now, of course, when you make the payment as an employer, you receive a tax deduction just as you would for any other payment of employee wages. And the way you structure the program could be used to either provide incentives, provide retention, or just offer additional benefits that you would not necessarily want to implement just through a straight taxable comp or taxable bonus. For example, you can increase the amount that you pay the longer that somebody's with you. So you could say, we'll give you $50 a month for the first 6 months that you work here. After that, increase it to $100. After you've worked for 2 years, it's $200. If you've worked for 5 years, it's $500. You can continue to push that up, which is a strong incentive for employees to stick around. We've also seen that the more people participate in student loan programs, the more they will participate in some of your other employee benefit programs. So that would include increases to their elective deferrals to your 401k plan, for example. If you're finding that it's a struggle to get younger employees to participate in the 401k plan because they're using those discretionary dollars to pay off their student loans, if you implement a program that helps them with those student loans, you may see increases in 401k participation, which of course would then help with your non-discrimination requirements under the 401k plan. And that kind of leads to the next topic, and what we've seen employers try to do is coordinate a student loan repayment program to fit in with other benefit programs. And you see this because a number of employees think that, well, I can either pay off my student loan, or I can put money in a Section 125 cafeteria plan, or I can contribute to the 401k, but I can't do them all. And if that's having a negative impact on your non-discrimination testing, you may want to consider how you incorporate the student loan program into a comprehensive benefits program. And as these programs proliferate and become more common, I think you see more creativity in how the student loan repayment program fits in with the other offerings. There's some efforts out there to tie contributions towards a student loan program to cafeteria plans, for example. And under Section 125, an employee can either receive cash or qualified benefits that they would receive tax-free. Under current law, student loan repayments that are provided by an employer do not qualify as benefits under Section 125. But there have been efforts, both legislatively and in structuring these programs, where you try to see some credits given under the 125 plan for amounts that employees are paying towards their student loans. And another area where you see this is tying employee payments for student loans with the employer's 401k plan. And this can get pretty complicated. An employer would receive a deduction if it pays towards the student loan, just as it would when it pays wages. But if it gives credit for the contribution for the student loan under the 401k plan, then there could be an opportunity to increase participation in both of these. And it also would encourage the younger employees or those that are struggling with student loan obligations to get that tax deferral by contributing to the plan. Anytime you're going to coordinate the student loan repayment program with a qualified plan, however, I think a fair amount of caution is warranted. Not only do you have the standard non-discrimination rules that you see in 401k plans and rules on matching requirements, but anytime you're going to coordinate with a 401k plan, for example, an employer would have to amend their plan and provide notice to plan participants as to how the changes to the 401k plan would impact all participants in the 401k plan. So for the employers out there who are receiving solicitations about how a student loan repayment assistance program could tie in with a 401k program, you do want to exercise caution and make sure that you're bringing your advisors in on both the student loan program and the 401k program to make sure that what you're doing meets all requirements for both programs. And just a note there, recent legislation, the Retirement Improvement and Savings Enhancements Act, would have legislatively incorporated student loan programs into qualified plan payments. So that's something that we're going to want to keep in mind from the perspective of the qualified plans and coordination and proposed legislation as well. So with that, we're about halfway through. I'll now turn it over to Vaishali, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the requirements of the regulatory requirements of these programs.
Thanks, Tony. So yeah, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the consumer financial implications of these kinds of repayment benefits. And I'm going to try to talk about it from a couple of different perspectives. The perspective of some things to keep in mind if you are a program administrator, some things that student loan servicers I know are aware of but maybe have to just keep front of mind, and of course the consumer financial implications for employers. So here, if you look at the top half of the screen, of course I think we may have all come across some companies that have started to offer the employer-assisted repayment benefit and have gotten really great press out of it. And it's a wonderful thing. I think you really can show that you are attractive to younger workers, that you are really current as to what your employees want and need. So it can be a very good thing. But I unfortunately do have to caution that what we don't want is the bottom half of the screen. And, you know, I wish this was a topic where, you know, any news was good news and this was, you know, like some celebrity TMZ sort of thing, but it's not. It's drier than that, and it can go wrong. And so we don't want to see an employer offering the benefit and a borrower saying they really didn't understand what they were getting, or that the program wasn't as effective in paying down loans as a borrower or an employee had thought it would be. And this really frames our conversation for today because student loans really are kind of a charged issue, and they have been for a number of years now. What I really want to go through is some of the ways in which student loan servicing has come front and center. But you see at the top of this slide here, student loan servicing issues, or rather servicing issues, really predate student loans. And so I'm not going to take you too far back. The servicing issues have been a topic of regulator concern for a long time, but just more in the recent past. I would say probably the thing to keep in mind was the financial crisis. And so what regulators really did is, of course, investigate and look at loan originations with respect to mortgages primarily. But then the area of investigation really changed and shifted focus to what was going on in loan servicing. And again, a lot of this was mortgage servicing during the crisis years. A lot of what regulators were looking at was the ways in which payments flowed through from borrowers to the servicer. And interestingly, those same kinds of issues have come up now with student loans, which is sort of basic stuff, really, if you think about it, but is actually a very complicated space. It's not an easy thing to do to apply payments correctly and in a manner that may be beneficial to a borrower, and there may be some disagreement about the ways in which payments can be applied that is of benefit to a borrower. So then shortly after that, I think, again, this kind of is full circle to where Tony started, because the numbers started to come out in news articles about the amount of outstanding student loan debt, and public opinion started to really shift on this topic. The regulator started to get consumer complaints on student loan issues, and student loan debt started to become termed a potential next crisis. And I don't think it's important that you have a feeling one way or the other about that word. My point in putting it on here is really to show you that this is a charged area, and it's one in which regulators have a primary focus. And so then what happened is the primary consumer financial regulator, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and multiple state attorneys general did start to investigate student loan servicing practices. Now, along the way, and some of that has resulted in some litigation that's ongoing, along the way, the Obama administration's Department of Education did put out really a policy kind of a memo to describe some best practices with student loan servicing. Again, this is a charged issue. My point in raising it is not to say everything in the memo is something that had to be adhered to, but it is to say there were best practices put out. And although that memo really has been rescinded by the new administration, I think the important point is if you look in the federal government's request for proposals on the new student loan servicing contracts for the federal government, a lot of those same issues are actually in the technical requirements. So again, not to get too into the weeds on it, but there are servicing kind of standards floating around, and there are some benchmark things that state and federal regulators look at in the way that payments are processed, in the way that borrowers get information about student loans. And some of this you see in the new administration kind of embracing what they are calling next generation servicing and processing, by talking about ways in which we might modernize student loan servicing going forward, and a little bit more of an emphasis on technology and innovation in this space. So that's kind of the background of what's been going on in student loan servicing over the last number of years, probably 10 years almost now, so kind of scarily, but it's true. And at the very bottom of the slide, I just put some other things going on with student loans. They're not really central to servicing, but there have been a number of for-profit schools investigations and litigations, of course, not to mention a number of news articles, TV shows about what goes on in different kinds of educational sectors. There have been back and forth and a little bit of battles on what is called borrower defense to repayment and whether borrowers are entitled to or do have the right to certain kinds of repayment defenses. And in the midst of it, and very importantly, some of the major student loan servicers have either changed names, acquired new companies, changed the ways in which they are servicing, taken on bigger portfolios, changed organizational structures, and all of that is very important because it's really an important thing to know that a borrower or an employee may not know or understand who their servicer is, or kind of all those changes that do take root. One of the regulatory, really on-point regulatory remarks that have been made has been in this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau report that came out in August of last year, specifically about this student loan repayment benefit. And so it's a really good thing if you have the chance to give it a scan to just go ahead and do so. It's not particularly long and it's well written. And I have it if you need it. Just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to send it to you. So the report highlights some of the things that do come up as challenges in administering this benefit, both on the servicer side and also on the side of perhaps some of the struggles that the program administrators may face. Some of that has to just do with the basic notion that student loan servicers are really not created equal. They come in all different shapes and sizes, and that's a good thing. They have been set up over time to service different kinds of student loans, of which there are many. And so there have been challenges with accepting electronic payments from third parties. My strong suspicion is that is slowly and rapidly changing as servicers really update their technology platforms and really, again, put technology front and center. But also there is a big question about the visibility into account information and what that looks like and what's appropriate. And how the servicers do respond to the various program administrators. And of course, the report does cite some of the issues that really relate to the couple slides prior that we just talked about, the regulatory history. Some of the general servicing challenges that are out there, things like whether payments are applied consistently across loan servicers. So, for example, loan servicer A may apply payments to particular loans first, because of course student loan borrowers usually have multiple loans. Loan servicer B could apply it to another kind of loan first, and you may receive ultimately a different outcome in the way the repayment benefit is administered. So some of these things, again, really relate to things regulators have been talking about for some time now with respect to student loan servicing. So I have got a couple of checklists. Actually, Tony and I both have checklists here to kind of help you along the way in thinking about some of the things that come up in the consumer financial regulatory space. I'm not going to run through this checklist in the order you see it, but I do want to kind of frame these things for you, and I want to highlight some of these things that are really unique to student loans. And so let me categorize them for you in a few different ways. One of the core concepts for student loan borrowers is that student loan borrowers could potentially be somewhat unsophisticated with respect to financial products. And some of this goes without saying, but just to really underscore, sometimes your employee may be somebody who really has never had a credit card. Frequently and more increasingly, rather, we see that younger Americans don't have cars or car loans. They may not have a mortgage, so they just really, truly may not have had that much interaction yet, and this is their first really stop to the way in which financial institutions work. So they may need some information, really. Maybe it's not even guidance, just information about how interest accrues. Most student loans, interest accrues in simple daily interest. They may need to understand how amortization works. So in my prior life, I worked at the Illinois Attorney General's office, and one of the consumer complaints that we often got on student loans was that my loan isn't paying down. I don't understand why my loan isn't paying down. And sometimes when you dig into that, the issue is really not understanding the way amortization works. So not understanding that interest is going to be paid down at different rates depending on where you are in your loan's life cycle. The other issue about student loans that's unique is that student loan borrowers usually have multiple loans. So if you're making just one payment to one loan, what is it as a program administrator that you may be recommending or using as the default option for the loan that you pay down first? For example, are you paying down the loan with the highest interest rate? So the psychology in consumer finance of paying down multiple loans is very fascinating, to me at least, and it's kind of a complicated thing. You know, even when I go to pay my student loans, I have this fixation to want to pay down the loan with the lowest balance, just because it would feel good to pay it off. But I really have to force myself to go ahead and make a payment to that loan with the higher interest rate, because paying it off quicker will be more beneficial. So those are some of the things that are a little bit unique in student loans, because you know, most of the times you only have one loan.
And Vaishali, I think that's a good example too of how employers can help their employees, especially those that don't have the most financial sophistication. So when you're structuring your program and you're thinking about, you know, some of the issues that your employees are confronting, things like that would be very valuable for an employer to add and really help their employees along in making the best choices.
Yeah, and that comes with other kinds of issues like having different kinds of loans in different repayment statuses. So sometimes borrowers are current on their private loans and they are delinquent or defaulted on their federal loans. And there are different options for those borrowers in each. I will tell you, a lot of borrowers don't even know the difference between federal and private loans. They don't even really know where to get the information on whether they have federal loans or private loans. It all sort of looks the same to them, particularly if you have the same servicer. So there are some pretty complicated factors there. Another, I think, very important thing for program administrators, many program administrators are offering refinances as ancillary products or services to offering the repayment benefit. And student loan refinance is a hot topic today. I could probably talk just an hour on that. But yeah, I think it's very important that through that marketing and through that process that the program administrator understands or sort of is transparent about what federal loan repayment benefits you may be giving up. Most of them are very akin and attuned to those kinds of issues, but it is something that is pretty front and center today. And then there are just different circumstances and nuances with respect to the very, very many repayment options that are out there. And so it's, Tony, before this presentation, I Googled how many repayment options there were, and I came up with all kinds of different numbers. Some sites say 7, 8, 9, others say up to 30. It probably depends on how you're characterizing the word repayment option. So again, there are a number of things that can affect whether a borrower gets the right information about this. So I think for vendors and servicers, a key question is, what are you doing? What expectations are you setting? Are you setting the expectations that you are kind of providing some counseling service? Are you setting up the expectation that you literally are just taking payments and passing it over to a servicer? What is the framework in which you're operating? I think that's very important also for employers to understand, is what is it that their vendor is providing to them? And one thing I would just keep in mind from the regulatory perspective is that even though, I think on first blush everyone would want to say, well, no, I'm not counseling anybody because I don't want to have the fiduciary responsibility of doing that. But I think a key thing to keep in mind is that you might just be becoming the de facto counselor by providing information. So more than ever, reviewing and knowing what information you're putting out there and in the manner in which you're doing it is really vital in this space. And the last thing I just want to touch on with this slide, because I would be remiss if I didn't, is privacy and data security. You know, this is one of those things that everybody thinks they've got it under control until they don't have it under control. And so I can't emphasize enough, you know, this is tricky for, and I think employers should also understand this for program administrators, that they need to protect borrowers' data information, and for servicers especially, but they also have to be able to allow these program administrators that are third parties to have the correct level of insight into a borrower's loan. And so this is a tough balance, but it's one that definitely can be pulled off and is pulled off.
So for employers who are listening, I think that last slide that Vaishali had, print this out when the student loan administrators come calling, and make sure that you're considering all of these issues. These are somewhat unique to the student loan repayment assistance program, and things that you may not have to do in your other benefits that you offer. So, you know, all of these things are critically important and things that both the employer and the administrator should be thinking about when you're implementing these programs.
So Tony, if it's okay with you, because we're a little low on time, I think Tony covered these things, but we're going to make this checklist, all of these checklists and these slides available to you, so you can definitely run through them and reach out to Tony with more questions you might have.
Yes, this slide here, just the basics. Go through how you're going to structure the program and think about these issues.
And so we really covered these concepts in this last slide. I just framed it a little bit differently. When I say the ABCs of student loan servicing in this checklist for employers, it's really all the things on the prior slide, which are, you know, what do you know? And, you know, of course, this repayment benefit can be offered by all different kinds of employers, which is a really great thing. And you just may not be the type of company that really needs to know about consumer financial regulatory frameworks, and nor should you really, but that's certainly what we're here for. And just one quick additional point is that vendor management and oversight is a very specific concept in consumer financial regulatory law. It isn't just a sort of guidepost. So it's something to really keep in mind, that when you're using this kind of a vendor, you really have to be aware of probably more things than you may be used to in other kinds of settings. You know, I just wanted to point out too, you know, I don't know that offering the repayment benefit is always right for every kind of company, but there are a lot of things you may be able to do to help your employees along the way, and I just wanted to offer some of these kind of creative ideas up. You know, perhaps your employees just need to get access to information. Maybe they need one-on-one counseling. I think a lot of these vendors provide, program administrators provide a lot of these things and have a lot of great information, and it may just be that you need to link up and really understand the different array of kind of options that may not even be financial in nature. And so in just closing, I'd say, you know, ask the experts, call us up or write us an email. This is not one of those things you can Google and really get the whole breadth of information. I have been working on student loan issues for longer than I care to characterize, and since before student loans were really a quote thing. So we would just be very happy to talk with you, and with that, I'd like to make sure we leave some time for questions.
We have had a couple questions that have come in, and hopefully if you do have any additional questions, you can use the chat feature on the webinar and submit them as we conclude here. First question that we have, how do we use this program for licensed professionals as opposed to all associates or all employees? And I think that's, you know, there's good and bad with there not being any tax ramifications of these programs at this point. And this is definitely one of the good features of that. For people who are working to attract and retain licensed professionals who may be coming out of medical school or professional school with 6 figures of student loan debt, you would want to target your program only to them. And current law allows you to do that because it's just as if you're paying them more in salary. So if you wanted to roll out a program that only applied to a very specific subset of your workforce that is particularly difficult to recruit and retain, you can do that, and you can structure the loan repayment program to maximize how you keep those people involved with your workforce. Another question that we have here, we have a program that is sponsored through our foundation, and student loan repayments are made by hours worked after graduation. And how is that program treated, which I think brings up an important point. The type of programs that we talked about here today are kind of specific in terms of their structure and the regulatory issues that go along with it, and kind of direct access to the servicers and the administrators. But it's just a subset of the full universe of how you can compensate your employees and structure their compensation to take into account student loans. For example, we've worked with clients who would like to pay a lump sum up front, for example, and they're trying to recruit, let's say, a physician, and pay $100,000 or $150,000 as a lump sum to get that physician to work for them. That's not uncommon in areas where there's a high demand for specialists, and it's very difficult to recruit someone there. And you can structure an employment agreement, for example, that would pay that entire amount, let's say $100,000 towards student loans, and you would require that physician to work for you for, let's say, 5 years. Ordinarily, at the time you make that payment, that full $100,000 is going to be taxed to the physician. We have worked with clients to structure it so that instead of treating that as a taxable payment, instead it would be treated as a loan to the employee, who then would repay that loan over time, and possibly even have those loan amounts forgiven over time based on work and service provided to the employer. This is an issue that you have to be very careful about with respect to the taxation of that. There's a relatively recent case, the Vancouver Clinic case. In that case, the employer tried to structure the program to recruit physicians as a loan, and the IRS determined that it was set up in a way that there was never any intention that those amounts would be paid back, and as a result, the initial outlay by the employer should have been taxable as compensation right away. So you do have to be careful, and if you're going to be structuring these types of programs as loans to your employees, it has to look like a loan. It has to have all of the characteristics of a loan. There has to be an interest rate. There has to be a term. There has to be a consequence in the event of default. So there are some things that you really need to think about when you are structuring those types of lump sum programs that would be focused just on a particular employee.
Hey Tony, I had a question for you. I was thinking through this. You know, one thing I probably should have mentioned in that regulatory history slide was that a lot of states are passing, and states have already, there are 4 jurisdictions that have passed student loan servicing licensing laws and regulatory requirements. And I think, you know, in large part because it's hard to get things done in Congress right now, states are really front and center in that. What do you think about, you know, you mentioned that Massachusetts example. What do you think? Do you think states will really kind of be more front and center in passing legislation on the tax benefits?
Yeah, and I think that's probably a trend that you'll see not only in this area but in a number of different areas, where individual states, especially in response to the new tax act that we got at the end of last year, individual states are going to try to they're going to make efforts to encourage the type of policy through their tax codes that they think would be valuable, and I think student loan programs certainly would be one of those.
We did just get another question. What type of financial relationships should the vendors offering these programs have? Is there FDIC, SEC, or money transmitter requirements? That is a very good question, and it certainly depends. So the different program administrators are set up to do different things, and that's why I sort of indicated it's really important to know how you as a program administrator fit into consumer financial regulatory schemes. And so I know this is not intended to be a shifty answer, but it does depend on what it is you're doing. And what I mean by that is there are state licensing requirements for things that the person who answered this question has pointed out, like money transmission. And it is a different question across the states as to whether you would fit into that statutory scheme. There's always things to look at with respect to SEC and also just, anti-money laundering. I mean, there are a number of federal big picture things to keep in mind besides consumer financial protection requirements when you are handling large sums of money and when you are taking them to and from borrowers. So, and then of course, if you are starting to hit that line between refinance, which, it's a complicated thing whether you are or not, but if you're not sure, you may have to also remind yourself to look at Truth in Lending Act requirements.
And so, I think that might be a good way to end it here, and a very good takeaway, because our goal is to help employers do this right. And it is a new area. There are a lot of new administrators and providers that are coming into this space, and sometimes it can feel like the Wild West out there. And so your goal as an employer should be to make sure you understand all the issues, you're structuring the program to best meet your needs for employee recruitment and employee retention, you're complying with all of the legal requirements, and it may not be very often that you as an employer have to deal with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, for example. But when you're structuring this type of program, you need to make sure that you and your administrators are doing that, and you're not going to have one of those bad headlines that Vaishali had talked about earlier.
Yeah, and same for the program administrators and loan services. I mean, loan services have been living, and they live and breathe the issues I talked about today. But this is a new kind of spin on the same issues they have been dealing with. And so again, how do you put yourself at a competitive advantage, including for the program administrators? The more you can emphasize that your program and the benefits you offer to your clients are really compliant with consumer financial laws, I think the better off everybody will be.
Well, thank you everyone for attending, and we invite you to contact us if you had any additional questions that we did not have time to address this afternoon, or would like any more information about the topics that we covered. This wraps our web conference for today, and thank you for your participation.